A thick blanket of fog hung over Boston Logan International Airport, turning the morning light into a diffuse gray glow. Inside Terminal E, travelers flowed through the space like schools of fish, business people with briefcases, families corralling, excited children, college students with oversized backpacks. Among them moved a slender woman in her early 70s, remarkable only in her unremarkability. Meryl Streep adjusted her plain navy baseball cap, tucking a strand of silver blonde hair behind her ear. She wore no makeup, simple wire-rimmed glasses, jeans, a loose gray sweater, and comfortable walking shoes. A small carry-on rolled behind her and she clutched a carefully wrapped package in her free hand. Nothing about her suggested she was the most Oscar-nominated actor in history, and that was precisely the point. Just for once, she had told her assistant the previous day, I want to be invisible. The assistant had raised an eyebrow, but knew better than to argue. After 50 years in the public eye, Meryl had earned the right to travel however she pleased. Her daughter Sophie was directing her first feature film in Vancouver, a small, intimate drama that Meryl had deliberately chosen not to appear in. You need to establish yourself without the weight of me hanging over everything, she had insisted. Sophie had agreed, reluctantly, but now 3 months into shooting, Meryl couldn't stay away any longer. She wanted to see her daughter in her element, commanding a set, bringing her vision to life. Hence the disguise, not elaborate, just understated enough to avoid recognition in a busy airport where people were focused on their own journeys. Meryl checked the departure board and located her gate, C18. She glanced at her watch, still 2 hours before boarding. Perfect timing. The gift in her hand, a vintage director's viewfinder that had once belonged to Mike Nichols, felt like a talisman. Sophie would understand its significance. She approached the first-class check-in counter, where a young man named Kevin, according to his name tag, was typing with aggressive efficiency, his expression broadcasting boredom and mild irritation. "Good morning," Meryl said softly, sliding her ID and printed reservation across the counter. Kevin barely glanced up. "Destination?" he asked flatly. "Vancouver," she replied, maintaining her warm smile despite his coldness. Kevin's eyes flicked to her computer screen, then back to her, taking in her casual attire with a quick, dismissive scan. "This is the first-class check-in," he said, as if explaining something to a child. Meryl nodded. "Yes, I know." A flicker of annoyance crossed his face as he picked up her ID, examining it with sudden interest. "Meryl Streep," he read aloud. Though his tone suggested the name meant nothing to him, she smiled again. "That's right." Kevin studied her face, comparing it to the ID photo. "You have a first-class ticket to Vancouver." The skepticism in his voice was unmistakable. "I do," Meryl confirmed, maintaining her composure despite the familiar, unwelcome feeling settling in her stomach. She'd experienced this before, the dismissal, the assumption that she couldn't possibly belong in premium spaces when she wasn't. Polished and camera-ready, Kevin typed something, frowning at his screen. "These tickets are quite expensive, you know." "I'm aware of the cost," she replied evenly. He continued typing, his expression growing more doubtful. "And you're traveling alone?" "Yes." "Purpose of travel?" "Visiting family," Meryl said, not elaborating. The package in her hand seemed to grow heavier. Kevin peered at her over his computer. "I'll need to see a credit card matching the name on the reservation." Meryl rummaged in her purse and produced the requested card. As she handed it over, a group of executives in tailored suits arrived at the next counter, where the agent greeted them with a deference entirely absent from Kevin's demeanor. "Is there a problem with my reservation?" Meryl finally asked, her voice still gentle but with a new firmness. Kevin pursed his lips. "Just being thorough, ma'am. We have protocols for first-class verification." The word "ma'am" contained multitudes, none of them respectful. Meryl straightened her posture slightly, remembering her daughter's frequent complaint. "Mom, you let people walk all over you when you're not in Meryl Streep mode." Perhaps Sophie had a point. After another minute of scrutiny, Kevin reluctantly tagged her bag. "You're at gate C18, Boarding begins at 10:45. He slid her documents back without making eye contact. Next, please. Meryl collected her boarding pass and ID, noting the additional SSS marked on her ticket, code for enhanced security screening. She sighed inwardly. This wouldn't be the easy, peaceful journey she'd hoped for. As she walked toward security, she texted her assistant. Made it to Logan, flying under the radar so far. Then, after a moment's consideration, she added, mostly. The security checkpoint loomed ahead, lines snaking between retractable barriers. Meryl joined the first-class priority line, aware of the sideways glances from other passengers. A woman in a business suit seemed particularly offended by Meryl's presence, looking her up and down with unconcealed judgment. Meryl smiled at her anyway. Decades in the public eye had taught her that kindness was rarely wasted, even when undeserved. As she waited, she thought about Sophie, fierce, talented. Sophie, directing actors twice her age with confidence inherited from both her parents. The thought warmed her, making the airport's indignities fade in importance. The package in her hand contained not just Mike's viewfinder, but a handwritten note from Steven Spielberg, offering encouragement to the fledgling director. Sophie would be moved by the gesture, by the tangible connection to cinema's greatest storytellers. Next, called the TSA agent, barely looking up, Meryl stepped forward, unaware that this simple journey was about to become considerably more complicated, or that Boston Logan International Airport would soon regret every moment of what was about to unfold. Meryl placed her carry-on purse and the carefully wrapped package into grey bins. She removed her shoes and light jacket, placing them in another bin, then stepped toward the body scanner. The TSA agent, a stern-faced woman with Patricia on her badge, held up a hand. Step aside, please. You've been selected for additional screening. Meryl's heart sank as she glanced at the SSSS on her boarding pass. Of course, she said quietly, moving to the designated area. Arms out, please, Patricia instructed, her voice clinical. Meryl complied as the agent waved a handheld detector over her body with methodical precision. Meanwhile, another agent had begun inspecting her belongings with unusual thoroughness. What's this? The second agent held up the wrapped package. A gift for my daughter, Meryl explained. We'll need to open it, he stated. Not a question. It's carefully wrapped, Meryl protested mildly. It's just a vintage viewfinder and a letter. Ma'am, if you want to board your flight, we need to examine all items. Patricia's tone left no room for negotiation. Meryl watched as they unwrapped the gift, handling the vintage viewfinder with none of the care it deserved. They passed it under scanners, swabbed it for explosive residue, and examined the sealed letter from Spielberg as if it might contain contraband. Who's this letter from? Patricia asked, squinting at the envelope. Steven Spielberg, Meryl replied. Honestly, Patricia's eyebrows shot up. You expect me to believe that? Meryl sighed. It's the truth. And you're taking this to your daughter, who's what, a filmmaker. The skepticism in Patricia's voice was unmistakable. She's directing her first feature, Meryl confirmed. Patricia exchanged a look with her colleague, a look Meryl recognized. All too well. The look that said, this ordinary-looking older woman is clearly delusional. And you said you're flying first class, Patricia continued, reviewing the boarding pass again. Yes. That's an expensive ticket for a... Patricia caught herself, but her implication hung in the air. For a what? Meryl asked quietly. Patricia busied herself with the scanner. Nothing, ma'am. Just doing my job. These are unusual items for most travelers. They continued the search, removing every item from Meryl's purse, her reading glasses, wallet, phone, a small notebook filled with observations about performances she admired, a tube of lip balm, and a packet of almonds. What's your occupation? Patricia asked suddenly. The question caught Meryl off guard. I'm an actor, she answered simply. An actor, Patricia repeated, her tone making it clear she didn't believe this for a second. Anyone I would know? Meryl suppressed a smile. Possibly. TV or movies? Both over the years. Patricia snorted softly. My husband's cousin is an extra on Law and Order. Got to stand near the main guy once. That's nice, Meryl responded politely. Behind them, a line had formed. Other passengers watched the thorough inspection, with a mixture of impatience and curiosity. A young man seemed to be studying Meryl's face with increased interest. After what felt like an eternity, Patricia grudgingly began returning Meryl's belongings to her. "You can repack now." "And the gift?" Meryl asked, looking at the now unwrapped viewfinder and letter, which sat forlornly on the inspection table. "You can have them back, but the wrapping paper had to be discarded," Patricia said, not sounding remotely apologetic. Meryl carefully placed the viewfinder and letter in her purse. The moment she'd planned, Sophie unwrapping the gift, discovering the treasures inside was now spoiled. She'd have to improvise something at the hotel. "Is that everything?" she asked, repacking her belongings with efficiency. "Almost," Patricia replied, producing a wand. "Just need to check your hair." "My hair?" Meryl touched her silver blonde locks reflexively. "Standard procedure for random checks," Patricia explained, though Meryl noticed no one else was receiving this level of scrutiny. Meryl removed her baseball cap and stood still as Patricia ran the wand through her hair. She felt her cheeks warm with humiliation as onlookers stared. Then, from behind her, "Excuse me, is that—" The young man who had been watching intently stepped closer, his expression incredulous. Patricia cut him off. "Sir, please stay back and wait your turn." "But that's Meryl—" "Sir!" Patricia's voice sharpened. "Back in line or I'll call security." The young man retreated, looking confused, but continuing to stare at Meryl with dawning recognition. After 30 minutes of enhanced screening, Meryl was finally cleared to proceed. She gathered her belongings, now haphazardly repacked, and headed toward her gate, feeling rattled but determined. She checked her watch. 45 minutes until boarding. Just enough time to compose herself and perhaps find a quiet corner to call Sophie. No, she decided. Better to maintain the surprise. She wouldn't let this airport experience diminish the joy of seeing her daughter. Meryl found an empty seat in the gate area and sat down, taking a moment to properly reorganize her belongings. As she did, she noticed a small tear in the sealed letter from Spielberg, likely from the forceful inspection. She traced the tear with her finger, disappointed but not defeated. Her phone chimed with a text from her assistant. "All set for Vancouver." "Hotel confirmed your early check-in," Meryl typed back. "On track, though, airport security was unexpectedly thorough. We'll call when I land." She slipped her phone into her purse and looked around the gate area. Business travelers tapped on laptops. A mother soothed a crying infant. Elderly couples sat with linked hands. Normal people doing normal things. Unbothered by the scrutiny Meryl had just endured, the young man from security appeared in the gate area, stealing glances in her direction. He seemed to be gathering courage, perhaps to approach her for an autograph or photo. Meryl braced herself for the interaction, preparing the gentle smile and polite demeanor she'd perfected over decades of public encounters. Instead, he picked up his phone, snapped a quick photo of her when he thought she wasn't looking, and began typing rapidly, undoubtedly sharing his celebrity sighting on social media. Meryl sighed inwardly. So much for traveling incognito. By the time she reached Vancouver, the internet might well be buzzing with photos of Meryl Streep dressed down at Logan Airport. She pulled out her book, Zadie Smith's latest novel, and tried to lose herself in the pages, unaware that her airport ordeal was far from over. The confrontation at security was just the beginning of what would become one of the most humiliating and ultimately consequential travel experiences of her life. Meryl had just settled into her book when the airport intercom crackled to life. "Would passenger Streep, Meryl, please report to the security desk at Checkpoint C. Passenger Streep to Checkpoint C, please." Heads turned throughout the gate area. The young man who had recognized her earlier looked up triumphantly, as if his suspicions had been confirmed. Meryl closed her book, a familiar knot of anxiety tightening in her stomach. What now? She approached a gate agent, a young woman whose nameplate read, "Beth." "Excuse me," Meryl said quietly. "I was just paged. Could you tell me where Checkpoint C security desk is located?" Beth looked up, her eyes widening slightly as recognition dawned. "Ms. Streep? You're—" "Yes," Meryl confirmed quickly, keeping her voice low. "Could you point me to the security desk?" "Of course," Beth replied, suddenly professional. "Back down the concourse, take a left at the food court. Is everything all right? Would you like an escort? No, thank you. I'm sure it's just a mix-up, Meryl. Retraced her steps, aware of the curious glances following her. So much for anonymity. The page had effectively announced her presence to the entire terminal. At checkpoint C, Patricia stood waiting with 2 other TSA agents and a man in a suit, who appeared to be a supervisor. His badge identified him as Richard Garfield, TSA coordinator. Ms. Streep, Richard said, his tone businesslike. Thank you for returning. We need to discuss an irregularity with your screening. Meryl felt her patience beginning to fray. What? Irregularity? I've been through the entire enhanced screening process already. Richard glanced at a tablet. According to our records, you're traveling on a first-class ticket to Vancouver. Is that correct? Yes, as I've confirmed multiple times now. And you're traveling alone? Meryl nodded, fighting to keep her voice level. Yes, to visit my daughter. The daughter who's a director, Patricia added, her skepticism still evident. Yes, Meryl replied. Sophie Gummer, she's filming in Vancouver. Richard and Patricia exchanged glances. Ms. Streep, Richard continued, we have some concerns about your identification. Your passport and ID check out, but... He hesitated. But what? Well, frankly, there's been some confusion about your identity, Meryl. Stared at him, momentarily speechless. My identity? You claim to be Meryl Streep, the actress, Richard said. I don't claim to be anyone, Meryl replied, her voice finally betraying her frustration. I am Meryl Streep. Patricia stepped forward. Ma'am, Meryl Streep is a famous movie star. She wouldn't be traveling alone without security, dressed like... She gestured vaguely at Meryl's casual attire. Meryl took a deep breath. After decades of inhabiting other people's lives, it was disorienting to have her own existence questioned. I understand I'm not dressed as you might expect, she said carefully. I'm traveling privately today. Not all celebrities travel with entourages. Richard looked unconvinced. The concern, Ms. Whoever you are, is that you're traveling on a high-value ticket with identification that may not be yours. You think I'm impersonating myself to... What? Steal my own identity for a plane ticket? Meryl asked, incredulous. Identity theft is a serious concern, Richard replied stiffly, especially in cases involving celebrities. A small crowd of travelers had begun to gather at a distance, sensing drama. Meryl felt her cheeks flush with a mixture of embarrassment and anger. This is absurd, she said. My identification is legitimate. The credit card I used is mine. I've answered all your questions. What more do you need? We'd like you to come to our office for further verification, Richard announced. Just a formality. A formality that will make me miss my flight, Meryl pointed out. The flight leaves in 30 minutes. Richard shrugged slightly. Security protocols take precedence over schedules, ma'am. Meryl glanced at her watch, then at the growing crowd of onlookers. She could insist on her identity, make a scene, demand to speak to higher authorities, or she could comply and hope to resolve this quickly. Fine, she said finally. But I'd like to call my daughter first. I'm afraid that won't be possible until we complete verification, Richard replied, if you'll follow me. They led her down a nondescript hallway to a small office with no windows. Inside were a metal table, 3 chairs, and a computer terminal. The fluorescent lighting cast harsh shadows across every surface. Please have a seat, Richard instructed, gesturing to a chair. Meryl sat, placing her purse in her lap. How exactly do you plan to verify my identity? We've contacted the airline's fraud department. They're checking your reservation details. Now, and what about my flight? Richard's expression remained impassive. As I said, security takes priority. Meryl closed her eyes briefly, centering herself. When she opened them, she spoke with the quiet authority that had commanded film sets. For decades, Mr. Garfield, I understand you have a job to do. But this has gone beyond reasonable security measures. I've been screened, questioned, had my belongings searched, and now detained. All because I don't match your mental image of what Meryl Streep should look like or how she should travel. Richard shifted uncomfortably. This isn't personal, Mom. It feels exceptionally personal, Meryl countered. And unless you have specific reason to believe I've committed a crime, I don't believe you have grounds to detain me further. The door opened, and a young TSA agent poked his head in. "Sir, there's something you should see." Richard stepped outside. Through the open door, Meryl could hear urgent whispers, and the word Twitter mentioned several times. When Richard returned, his expression had changed subtly. "It appears that your presence in the airport has been noted on social media." "I saw someone taking my photo earlier," Meryl acknowledged. "Yes, well," Richard cleared his throat. "The posts are getting significant attention. Your name is trending." Meryl nodded, unsurprised. "Does this help with your verification process?" Before Richard could answer, the door burst open again. A different TSA agent rushed in, visibly agitated. "Sir, the airline manager is on the phone. He's asking why Meryl Streep is being held in security. He says the media is calling for comment." Richard's face paled. "Media?" "Yes, sir, TMZ, apparently." The atmosphere in the room shifted palpably. Richard's posture straightened, and Patricia, who had been hovering near the door, suddenly looked deeply concerned. "Ms. Streep," Richard began, his tone markedly different. "There appears to have been a misunderstanding." "Indeed," Meryl agreed calmly. "We'll escort you to your gate immediately. Your flight has been held for you." Meryl raised an eyebrow. "That won't be necessary. I can find my own way." "I insist," Richard pressed, "as a courtesy." "The courtesy would have been treating me with respect from the beginning," Meryl replied, standing and gathering her belongings. "Not after discovering my name is trending on Twitter." As she stepped into the hallway, flanked by now solicitous TSA agents, Meryl knew the worst was yet to come. The story was out. The quiet trip to surprise Sophie had unraveled completely. And somewhere in this airport, decisions were being made about how to handle the public relations disaster that was already brewing. She squared her shoulders and walked forward, dignity intact despite everything. If there was one thing Meryl Streep knew how to do, it was to face the cameras, invited or not, with grace. Meryl walked briskly through the terminal, Richard and Patricia struggling to keep pace behind her. News of her detention had evidently spread. Phones turned in. Her direction as she passed, capturing photos and videos of the unfolding drama. "Ms. Streep," Richard called, slightly breathless, "please let us escort you properly." "I'm perfectly capable of finding my gate," Meryl replied without slowing. She checked her watch. 10 minutes until scheduled departure. The flight had been held, but for how long? As she rounded the corner to gate C-18, Meryl saw a small crowd gathered at the desk. A harried gate agent named Thomas was gesturing emphatically, his voice rising above the general murmur. "The flight is fully boarded. We cannot delay any longer." Meryl approached the desk. "Excuse me, I believe you're holding this flight for me." Thomas turned, irritation plain on his face. He glanced at Meryl, then at Richard and Patricia, hovering anxiously behind her. "Name?" he asked curtly. "Meryl Streep." Thomas consulted his tablet, frowning. "Yes, we were notified about your situation." He put strange emphasis on the last word. "Unfortunately, we've reached our departure window. FAA regulations require—" "You were specifically instructed to hold the flight," Richard interrupted. "This is Meryl Streep." Thomas looked at Meryl again, his expression dubious. "So I've been told." He turned back to his tablet. "I'm showing—" "Your boarding pass was already scanned." "That's impossible," Meryl said. "I've been detained at security." "Nevertheless, our system shows you've boarded." Thomas gestured to the jetway. "The aircraft door is closed. I'm sorry, but you'll have to take the next flight." A ripple of whispers spread through the onlookers. Phones continued recording the scene. "There must be a mistake," Richard insisted. "Check again." Thomas sighed dramatically and tapped at his screen. "According to our manifest, Seat 2A, your assigned seat, Ms. Streep, is currently occupied." "By whom?" Meryl asked. "I don't have that information," Thomas replied, though his shifting gaze suggested otherwise. A woman in the crowd stepped forward. "I was in the boarding line. They gave her seat away to a standby passenger, a man in a suit." "Is this true?" Meryl asked Thomas. The gate agent's expression hardened. "We followed protocol for no-shows." "I wasn't a no-show," Meryl pointed out. "I was detained by TSA." She gestured toward Richard and Patricia, who looked increasingly uncomfortable. "That's not our concern," Thomas replied. Airport security issues are separate from airline operations. Meryl took a deep breath, maintaining her composure. When is the next flight to Vancouver? Thomas consulted his tablet again. Nothing today. First flight tomorrow is at 7:45 a.m. That's unacceptable, Richard interjected. This is Meryl Streep. So everyone keeps saying, Thomas muttered, just loud enough to be heard. A new voice entered the conversation. Is there a problem here? A woman in an airline uniform with a manager's badge approached. Her nameplate read, Diane Phillips, customer. Service manager. Miss Phillips, Richard began, relief evident in his voice. There's been a significant misunderstanding. This is Meryl Streep. She was wrongfully detained by security, and now her seat has apparently been given away. Diane assessed the situation, her gaze moving from Richard to Meryl to the crowd of onlookers with their phones raised. I see, she said finally. Miss Streep, I apologize for the confusion. If you'll come with me, we can discuss alternatives. In private. Meryl nodded, grateful for the apparent voice of reason. Diane led her to a small room behind the gate desk, motioning for Richard and Patricia to remain outside. Once the door closed, Diane's professional demeanor shifted subtly. Let I be frank, she began. This situation has become problematic. I couldn't agree more, Meryl replied. Our records show you were issued a boarding pass, but were subsequently flagged for security concerns. Diane's tone was clipped, almost accusatory. During that time, your seat was reassigned according to standard procedure. The security concerns were unfounded, Meryl pointed out. I was detained because your staff and TSA didn't believe I was myself. Diane's expression remained impassive. Regardless, the flight has departed. We can rebook you on tomorrow's flight. That's not acceptable. I need to reach Vancouver today. I'm afraid that's not possible. Meryl studied the manager carefully. Ms. Phillips, I've been a loyal customer of this airline for decades. I've been publicly humiliated, detained without cause, and now denied boarding. Surely there are alternatives. We could attempt to route you through Seattle or Portland, Diane offered reluctantly. But those flights are likely full. Please check. Diane tapped at her tablet. As I suspected, no availability. Meryl reached for her phone. Then I'll need to make other arrangements. Before you do that, Diane said quickly, I should inform you that this incident has attracted considerable attention. Our corporate communications team is already receiving media inquiries. I'm not surprised. It would be in everyone's best interest if we could resolve this quietly. Meryl raised an eyebrow. Quietly. We're prepared to offer compensation for your inconvenience. A voucher for future travel, perhaps an upgrade to first class. I already had a first-class ticket, Meryl interrupted. Of course, Diane backtracked. Perhaps membership in our chairman's circle, then. It includes priority services, lounge access. Ms. Phillips, Meryl said firmly. I don't want compensation. I want to reach Vancouver today, as planned, to surprise my daughter. Diane's professional mask slipped further. With all due respect, Ms. Streep, if that's truly who you are, we've done everything possible to accommodate you despite the unusual circumstances. Unusual circumstances? A woman traveling alone, dressed casually, claiming to be a celebrity, then causing disruptions throughout the terminal. Surely you can understand our position. Meryl stood, gathering her belongings. I understand perfectly. Thank you for your time. She opened the door to find Richard, Patricia, and now a small crowd of airline staff and curious passengers waiting outside. Phones immediately raised again, capturing her exit. Mrs. Streep, Richard began anxiously. What can we do to help? Nothing, thank you, Meryl replied calmly. I'll be making alternative arrangements. As she walked away, she heard Diane behind her. Ma'am, Miss, whoever you are, you can't just walk away. We need to complete your incident report. Meryl continued walking, dignity intact, despite the chaos swirling around her. She pulled out her phone and dialed her daughter's number. Sophie, it's Mom. I'm having some trouble at the airport. She listened for a moment. No, nothing serious. Just a misunderstanding that's gotten out of hand. Another pause. Actually, I think I might need your help after all. As she spoke, Meryl noticed airport security officers approaching from both directions, flanking her path through the terminal. Behind them, Richard, Patricia and Diane followed, looking increasingly concerned. "Sophie," Meryl continued, her voice steady despite the growing tension, "I think I'm about to be escorted out of Boston Logan Airport. Can you believe it?" Sophie's shocked response was audible even without speakerphone. Meryl managed a small smile despite everything. "Don't worry, darling, I'm fine. But perhaps you should make a few calls. It seems your mother is causing quite a scene." The security officers reached her, positioning themselves on either side. "Mrs. Streep," one said formally, "we've been asked to escort you to the main terminal exit." Meryl nodded, still holding the phone. "Of course. I'll go quietly," she assured them, with just enough theatrical emphasis that several onlookers chuckled nervously. To Sophie, she added, "I'll call you back shortly. This should be interesting." She ended the call and tucked her phone away, then gestured graciously to the officers. "Lead the way, gentlemen. It seems my performance at Logan Airport has reached its final act." The security officers flanked Meryl as they walked through the terminal, creating a surreal procession that drew stares from every direction. Behind them trailed Richard, Patricia and Diane, a trio of increasingly anxious officials whose whispered conversations grew more urgent with each passing minute. "Ms. Streep," the taller officer said quietly, "we're instructed to escort you to the main terminal exit. Your luggage will be retrieved and delivered to you there." "Thank you," Meryl replied with the same gracious tone she might use accepting an award. "May I ask who instructed you to remove me from the airport?" The officers exchanged glances. "Airport management, ma'am." "I see. And the specific reason?" "We weren't provided details, ma'am, just following orders." A young woman approached, phone extended. "Mrs. Streep, can I get a selfie?" Before Meryl could respond, one of the officers stepped between them. "Step back, please. Official airport business." The young woman retreated, but not before calling out, "They can't treat you like this. I'm posting everything online." Meryl offered a small smile of acknowledgement. The court of public opinion was already in session, it seemed. As they passed the food court, Meryl noticed a television mounted on the wall. A news ticker scrolled across the bottom. "Breaking. Award-winning actress Meryl Streep reportedly detained at Boston Logan Airport." Richard noticed it too. His pace faltered as he pulled out his phone, scrolling frantically. Whatever he saw caused his face to pale considerably. "Miss Phillips," he called to Diane, "you need to see this." Diane glanced at his phone screen, her professional composure visibly cracking. She hurried forward, attempting to position herself in front of the security officers. "Perhaps we should reconsider," she suggested, her voice strained. "This situation has escalated unnecessarily." "You think?" Meryl couldn't resist the dry response. "Ms. Streep," Diane continued, "if we could just return to my office to discuss—" "I believe we've discussed enough," Meryl replied calmly. "So your position was quite clear, and now I'm being escorted out as requested." "There's been a misunderstanding," Diane insisted. "Several, in fact," Meryl agreed. More travelers had gathered, forming an impromptu audience to the unfolding drama. Phones recorded from every angle. Someone started a slow clap that quickly fizzled out in the awkward tension. "Could everyone please disperse?" Richard called out, his authority undermined by the slight crack in his voice. "This is an official security matter." "What did Meryl Streep do?" someone shouted back. "Nothing," Meryl answered before Richard could respond. "Absolutely nothing." They had reached the main terminal now, approaching the security exit. Once Meryl passed through, she would need a new boarding pass to re-enter, a boarding pass she no longer had. "Miss Streep," Diane tried again, desperation evident in her tone, "on behalf of the airline, I'd like to offer a formal apology and immediate rebooking on our partner airline. There's a flight to Vancouver departing in 2 hours." Meryl paused, turning to face the manager. "That's quite a change of position, Miss Phillips." Diane's professional smile had taken on a rictus quality. "We always strive to provide excellent customer service." "Indeed, particularly when the customer's name is trending on Twitter." Richard stepped forward. "Miss Streep, I also extend my sincere apologies. There has clearly been a catastrophic breakdown in communication." "Clearly," Meryl agreed. The officers, unsure how to proceed given the rapidly changing dynamics, maintained their positions flanking Meryl. "Are we continuing to the exit?" one asked uncertainly. Before anyone could answer, a commotion erupted. At the terminal entrance, a tall woman with Meryl's unmistakable bone structure pushed through the crowd, trailed by two men in suits who appeared to be airline executives. "Mom," Sophie called, her voice carrying across the terminal. Relief and surprise washed over Meryl's face. "Sophie, how did you—" "I was already in Boston," Sophie explained, reaching her mother and embracing her tightly. "Surprise ruined, I guess. I flew in to see you before heading back to Vancouver." She turned to the assembled airport staff, her expression fierce. "Would someone like to explain why my mother is being forcibly removed from this airport?" The two men in suits stepped forward, introducing themselves as the Regional Director and Chief of Customer Experience for the airline. Their carefully rehearsed apologies tumbled over each other in a symphony of corporate damage control, a regrettable series of misunderstandings, investigating how this occurred, absolutely not reflective of our policies. Sophie cut them off with a raised hand. "Save it. I've been watching this disaster unfold on social media for the past hour. Every passenger in this terminal has been documenting how you've treated one of the most respected actresses in the world like a suspicious person." She turned to Richard and Patricia. "And you two, TSA detained my mother because you didn't believe she was Meryl Streep? Did none of you think to, I don't know, Google her?" Richard looked at his shoes. Patricia suddenly found the ceiling fascinating. "In our defense," Richard began weakly, "she doesn't look like—" "Like what?" Sophie challenged. "Like what you think Meryl Streep should look like, because she's not wearing makeup or designer clothes, because she's traveling alone like a normal person." The regional director attempted to salvage the situation. "Ms. Gummer, Ms. Streep, please accept our most profound apologies. We're prepared to offer immediate accommodation on our next available flight, full compensation and nothing," Sophie interrupted. "My mother has been publicly humiliated. She's been detained, questioned, had her property searched, been accused of identity theft, had her seat given away, and then been escorted out like a criminal." Meryl placed a calming hand on her daughter's arm. "Sophie, it's all right." "It's not all right, Mum." Sophie's protective fury was a force to behold. "This isn't how anyone should be treated, celebrity or not." The crowd that had gathered murmured, in agreement. The number of phones recording the confrontation had multiplied. One of the security officers cleared his throat. "Ma'am, should we continue the escort or—" The regional director quickly intervened. "That won't be necessary. In fact, we'll be escorting Ms. Streep and Ms. Gummer to our first-class lounge while we arrange immediate transportation to Vancouver on our corporate partner's aircraft." Meryl finally spoke, her voice carrying the quiet authority that had commanded film sets for decades. "Thank you for the offer, but I think I'd prefer to make my own arrangements." She turned to Sophie. "I'm sorry your surprise was ruined, darling." Sophie's expression softened. "Are you kidding? This is better. Now I get to swoop in and rescue the great Meryl Streep. Wait until the crew hears about this." For the first time since arriving at the airport, Meryl laughed, a genuine warm sound that seemed to break the tension hovering over the scene. The regional director stepped forward again. "Ms. Streep, please allow us to make this right." Meryl regarded him thoughtfully. "Perhaps you can, but not in the way you think." She glanced around at the assembled staff, at Richard, Patricia, Diane, Thomas, all watching nervously. "I think we have some things to discuss about how people are treated in this airport, regardless of who they are." The executive nodded solemnly. "Yes, we do." Meryl and Sophie were ushered into the airline's executive lounge, a stark contrast to the public spectacle that had unfolded minutes earlier. The regional director, who had introduced himself as James Harrington, dismissed the security officers with a terse nod, then closed the lounge doors behind them. "Please, make yourselves comfortable," he offered, gesturing to plush leather chairs. "Can I get you anything? Water, coffee, perhaps something stronger?" "Water would be fine," Meryl replied, settling into a chair. Sophie remained standing, her posture tense. "I'd like an explanation," Sophie stated flatly. Harrington nodded, dispatching his assistant to fetch water. "Of course. We're still piecing together exactly what happened, but I want to assure you that this is not how we typically operate." "And yet it happened," Sophie pointed out. She paced the room with the same intensity Meryl had seen her direct actors on set. My mother was profiled, detained, and humiliated for no reason other than she didn't match someone's idea of what Meryl Streep should look like. Meryl watched her daughter with a mixture of pride and concern. Sophie had inherited not just her cheekbones, but her fierce sense of justice. "Sophie," she said gently, "perhaps we should hear Mr. Harrington out." Sophie took a deep breath and sat beside her mother, though the tension in her shoulders remained. Harrington looked genuinely distressed. "Ms. Streep, Ms. Gummer, I can't begin to express how deeply sorry we are. What began as a routine security screening clearly spiraled into something inexcusable." "I'd like to know why my seat was given away," Meryl said. "Even after the airline was notified I was being detained." "That's one of many questions we're investigating," Harrington assured her. "It appears there was a significant breakdown in communication between security and gate staff." The assistant returned with water and a folder of documents, which he handed to Harrington. "We've arranged private transportation for you both," Harrington continued. "Our partner airline has a jet departing for Vancouver at 3 p.m. We've reserved the entire first-class cabin for your privacy." Sophie shook her head. "That's not addressing the actual problem." "I understand your frustration." "No, you don't," Sophie interrupted. "This isn't about getting special treatment now. It's about the fact that my mother was treated differently, because of how she was dressed and because she was traveling alone, and because she's a woman of a certain age," Meryl added quietly. Harrington's expression grew more somber. "You're absolutely right. There are systemic issues here that need to be addressed." A knock at the door interrupted them. The assistant opened it to reveal Richard and Patricia, both looking distinctly uncomfortable. "Ms. Streep," Richard began, "we'd like to personally apologize for our role in this incident." Meryl studied them thoughtfully. "Please come in." They entered hesitantly, standing awkwardly near the door as if prepared for a quick escape. "I understand you were following procedures," Meryl said, "but I'd like to know why those procedures seem to single me out." Patricia spoke up, her earlier skepticism replaced by visible remorse. "That's just it, Miss Streep. We weren't following procedures, not properly. We made assumptions based on the appearances." "Assumptions," Meryl repeated. "Yes," Patricia admitted. "When you said you were an actress, Meryl Streep specifically, I didn't believe you because—" She hesitated. "Because I wasn't wearing makeup," Meryl suggested. "Because I was in comfortable clothes. Because I didn't have an entourage." "Yes," Patricia said simply. "I had a certain image in my mind of what a famous actress should look like, especially one traveling first class. And you didn't match that image." Sophie leaned forward. "So you automatically assumed she was lying," Richard interjected. "It's more complicated than that. We deal with security risks daily, including people misrepresenting their identity. But," he added quickly, seeing Sophie's expression darken, "that's no excuse. We made a judgment based on appearance, and that was wrong." "It was," Meryl agreed, "and I suspect I'm not the only traveler who's been subjected to this kind of scrutiny based on superficial factors." Harrington cleared his throat. "This incident has already prompted an internal review of our protocols, but I think there's an opportunity here for more meaningful change." "I'm listening," Meryl said. "Would you be willing to work with us to help us develop better training for staff on unconscious bias and fair treatment of all passengers?" Sophie raised an eyebrow. "You want my mother to help fix your PR disaster?" "Sophie," Meryl touched her daughter's arm. "Let's hear him out," Harrington continued earnestly. "This isn't just about public relations. It's about making real improvements. Mrs. Streep's experience, painful as it was, highlights issues that affect countless travelers who don't have her platform or resources." Meryl considered this. Throughout her career, she had used her voice to advocate for various causes. Perhaps this was another opportunity to effect change. "I'd need to think about it," she said finally. "My schedule is quite full." "Of course," Harrington replied. "Any involvement, even just your insights, would be invaluable." The assistant reappeared at the door. "Mr. Harrington, we have a situation developing." "What now?" Harrington asked wearily. "The media has arrived. Several news vans are outside the terminal, and we've received requests for statements from major networks." Sophie stood. "Well, that was quick." Meryl remained seated, contemplative. The public narrative was forming rapidly. The beloved actress mistreated by bumbling officials. It would make for dramatic headlines, certainly. But was that the story she wanted told? "Mr. Harrington," she said, "I'd like to speak with you and your communications team about how we handle this publicity." Harrington looked surprised. "You? Would? Yes, I have no interest in vilifying your staff or damaging your airline's reputation. What happened today reflects broader issues in how people are judged, based on appearance, age, gender, any number of factors." She looked at Richard and Patricia. "You two made mistakes today, but you've also acknowledged them honestly. That counts for something." Sophie stared at her mother. "Mom, after everything they put you through, you're willing to help them manage this crisis." Meryl smiled slightly. "I'm willing to help ensure something constructive comes from it. A news cycle of outrage won't change anything." Harrington appeared genuinely moved. "Mrs. Streep, that's incredibly gracious. Don't mistake it for forgiveness just yet," Meryl cautioned. "I'm still quite upset about the whole ordeal, but I've spent my career trying to understand different perspectives. It seems appropriate to apply that skill here." Sophie shook her head, but her expression had softened. "Always the diplomat." "Just trying to be practical," Meryl replied. "Shall we discuss next steps?" As the group began formulating a plan, Meryl felt her phone vibrate. She glanced down to see a text from her assistant. "TMZ reporting you were forcibly removed from Logan Airport. Need me to intervene?" Meryl showed the message to Sophie, who rolled her eyes. "And so begins the media circus." "Indeed," Meryl agreed. "Though I think we might be able to direct this particular performance toward a more meaningful conclusion than most." She turned back to the awaiting airport officials, her expression resolved. The day's journey had veered wildly off course, but perhaps it was heading somewhere important after all. The airline's crisis management team assembled with remarkable speed. Within 30 minutes, the executive lounge had transformed into an impromptu war room. Communications specialists huddled over laptops. The airline's legal counsel whispered urgently with Harrington, and a nervous social media coordinator provided real-time updates on the unfolding online reaction. "It's trending nationally now," she reported, showing her screen to Harrington. "Meryl stranded and Logan Gate are the top hashtags." Harrington winced. "What's the general sentiment?" "Overwhelmingly supportive of Ms. Streep, calling for boycotts of the airline. Several celebrities have already tweeted their outrage." Meryl, seated at the center of this storm, maintained her characteristic composure. Sophie remained beside her, occasionally whispering observations that made her mother smile despite everything. "Mom, Viola Davis just tweeted that she's ready to personally escort you on your next flight." Meryl laughed softly. "That sounds like Viola." The lounge door opened, and a distinguished man in his 60s entered, moving with the confident authority of someone accustomed to command. The room fell silent as he approached. "Ms. Streep," he said, extending his hand. "I'm Marcus Reynolds, airport director. I came as soon as I heard what happened. Please accept my deepest apologies for how you were treated today." Meryl shook his hand. "Thank you, Mr. Reynolds. I've spent the last hour reviewing security footage and speaking with staff," Reynolds continued. "What I've seen is deeply troubling and completely contrary to our values and protocols." Unlike the nervous apologies from others, Reynolds' regret seemed genuine and personal. He turned to Sophie. "Ms. Gummer, I understand you arrived in the midst of this situation. I apologize to you as well." Sophie nodded acknowledgement, her expression guarded but less hostile than before. Reynolds addressed the room at large. "I'd like a moment alone with Ms. Streep and Ms. Gummer, if I may." The staff quickly filed out, leaving only Meryl, Sophie, Reynolds, and Harrington in the lounge. "Ms. Streep," Reynolds began, once the door closed, "I've worked in airport management for 32 years. In that time, I've dealt with security threats, weather emergencies, even a small plane crash on our runway. But I've never been more disturbed than by what I witnessed today." "It was certainly an experience," Meryl replied. "Diplomatically, it was a systematic failure," Reynolds corrected. "Not just of protocols, but of basic human decency and common sense." He sat across from them, his expression grave. "I've asked the staff involved in your detention and removal to join us shortly. Not for a public shaming, but because I believe recognition, Truly seeing and acknowledging one's mistakes is the first step toward meaningful change. Sophie leaned forward. So they'll face actual consequences? Yes, Reynolds confirmed. There will be appropriate disciplinary action. But more importantly, this incident will drive substantive changes in our training and procedures. Harrington added, we've already begun drafting new guidelines for verification procedures that don't rely on subjective assessments of appearance or status. Meryl studied both men thoughtfully. I appreciate that. Though I suspect changing institutional culture is more complicated than updating a manual. Indeed it is, Reynolds agreed, which is why personal accountability matters so much. A knock at the door announced the arrival of the assembled staff. Kevin from check-in, Patricia and Richard from TSA, Thomas the gate agent, and Diane from customer service. They entered warily, like students summoned to the principal's office. The transformation in their demeanor was remarkable. Gone was the dismissive skepticism, the bureaucratic indifference. In its place was a palpable mix of embarrassment, shame, and nervous anticipation. Kevin's eyes widened as he took in Meryl's presence. Oh my God, he muttered, the color draining from his face. It really is you. Yes, Meryl confirmed simply. Thomas, the gate agent, stepped forward. Ms. Streep, I don't know what to say. I gave away your seat. I didn't believe... He trailed off, his professional facade crumbling. Diane looked as though she might be ill. When I saw the news reports, the photos online, I realized immediately. You tried to tell us and we just wouldn't listen. Patricia nodded miserably. I even unwrapped your gift for your daughter. The viewfinder from Mike Nichols. I thought you were making it up. Meryl's expression softened slightly at the mention of the gift. Yes, that was particularly disappointing. Reynolds addressed the group sternly. Each of you played a role in what happened today. I want you to really look at Ms. Streep and Ms. Gummer and tell them what you see now that you failed to see earlier. An uncomfortable silence fell over the room. Finally, Kevin spoke. I see Meryl Streep, he said quietly. One of the greatest actresses of all time, someone I've actually watched in dozens of films. But earlier, I just saw an older woman in casual clothes who I decided couldn't possibly belong in first class. Thomas nodded. I saw someone I could dismiss because they didn't match my expectations. I made assumptions based on appearance, not facts. One by one they offered similar realizations, painful acknowledgements of bias and prejudice thinly veiled as procedure or protocol. Meryl listened to each confession with quiet attentiveness. When they finished, she spoke thoughtfully. Thank you for your honesty. It can't have been easy. She paused, choosing her words carefully. What troubles me most isn't that you didn't recognize me specifically. It's that you used that non-recognition to justify treating me with suspicion and disrespect. She leaned forward slightly. I wonder how many travelers pass through this airport daily who don't look right to you in some way. How many are detained, questioned, made to feel unwelcome, simply because they don't fit your mental image of where they belong? The staff exchanged uncomfortable glances, the implications of her words sinking in. That's precisely why this incident matters beyond today, Reynolds interjected. It's illuminated patterns of behavior that affect countless travelers who don't have Mrs. Streep's platform or resources. Sophie, who had been uncharacteristically quiet, finally spoke. I direct films now, and one thing I've learned is that people perform the way they're directed. The system here directed all of you to make quick judgments based on appearance, to sort people into categories of suspicious or trustworthy based on how they look. She looked around the room. That's not entirely your fault, but recognizing it happened is just the beginning. The real question is what happens tomorrow and the day after. Reynolds nodded. An excellent point, Ms. Gummer, which brings me to why I've asked you all here. He turned to Meryl. Ms. Streep, I understand Mr. Harrington has proposed you might work with us to improve our training. I'd like to extend that invitation formally, on behalf of the entire airport authority. Meryl glanced at Sophie, who gave an almost imperceptible nod. I'm willing to consult on the effort, Meryl agreed, though I think you'll need professionals in bias training and institutional change to do the real work. Absolutely, Reynolds confirmed. We've already reached out to several experts. Your insights would complement their expertise if you're willing. As they discussed next steps, Meryl noticed Patricia staring at her with an expression of dawning recognition that went beyond celebrity identification. "I just realized," Patricia said softly, "my mother loves you in The Devil Wears Prada. She watches it every Christmas. She'd be mortified if she knew what happened today." For the first time since arriving at the airport that morning, Meryl smiled genuinely. "Perhaps you should tell her. Some of the most important recognitions happen in hindsight." As the meeting in the executive lounge concluded, Harrington's assistant entered with an urgent message. "Sir, the media situation has escalated. There are now reporters from all major networks at the terminals, and they're interviewing passengers who witnessed Ms. Streep's removal." Harrington exchanged a concerned glance with Reynolds. "We need to issue a statement immediately." "Before we do," Meryl interjected, "I'd like to speak with them." The room fell silent. Sophie turned to her mother in surprise. "Mom, are you sure you don't have to face those cameras?" Meryl patted her daughter's hand. "I know, but I think I should." Reynolds leaned forward. "Miss Streep, we can handle the press. You've been through enough today." "I appreciate that," Meryl replied. "But this story is already forming without my input. I'd prefer to shape it directly." Her quiet authority seemed to settle the matter. Harrington nodded to his assistant. "Arrange for a press area in the conference room. Limited access, selected outlets only." "All outlets," Meryl corrected. "Equal access." "Of course," Harrington conceded. While preparations were made, Meryl excused herself to freshen up. In the privacy of the executive bathroom, she studied her reflection. The woman in casual clothes who had been deemed unsuitable for first class, unrecognizable as herself. She smoothed her silver blonde hair, straightened her sweater, and nodded once at her reflection. She didn't need to transform into Meryl Streep the icon to command respect. When she returned, Sophie was waiting. "Are you really okay with this?" "I am," Meryl assured her. "I've spent my career finding the humanity in difficult characters. Today I'm just returning the favor." The conference room had been hastily arranged with a podium facing rows of chairs. As Meryl entered, flanked by Sophie, Reynolds, and Harrington, a buzz of excitement rippled through the assembled reporters. Cameras turned toward her, microphones extended, and a flurry of questions erupted. Reynolds stepped to the podium first. "Thank you all for coming. I'm Marcus Reynolds, Airport Director. I'll make a brief statement. Then, Ms. Streep has graciously agreed to address your questions." He offered a succinct summary of the day's events, acknowledging the completely unacceptable treatment Meryl had received and outlining the immediate steps being taken in response. When he finished, he gestured for Meryl to take his place. She approached the podium with the same composed grace she might bring to an awards ceremony. The room fell silent in anticipation. "Good afternoon," she began. "This has certainly been an unexpected day." A ripple of laughter broke the tension. "I came to Boston Logan Airport this morning, hoping to travel quietly and anonymously to surprise my daughter in Vancouver. Instead, I found myself at the center of a situation that has now drawn national attention." She paused, surveying the room of reporters. "I could detail every indignity I experienced today, being questioned at check-in, subjected to enhanced screening, having my personal items searched, being detained by security, and ultimately removed from the airport. But those details are less important than the underlying issues they reveal." Meryl gestured to the airport staff standing to the side of the room. Kevin, Patricia, Richard, Thomas, and Diane, all looking profoundly uncomfortable. These individuals made mistakes today, serious ones. They've acknowledged those mistakes and are facing consequences, but I didn't ask them to be here to shame them. I asked them to be here because confronting uncomfortable truths is how we grow. She turned back to the reporters. "The truth is, I was profiled today, not because of my race or religion, but because I didn't match someone's mental image of who belongs in first class or who Meryl Streep should be." Her voice remained steady, but took on a deeper resonance. "I'm a 72-year-old woman who chose to travel in comfortable clothes without makeup. I was deemed suspicious because I didn't look right in my assigned space. That's troubling, not just for me, but for what it reveals about how we categorize and judge people based on appearance. A reporter called out, "Ms. Streep, will you be taking legal action against the airline or airport?" "No," Meryl replied firmly. "What happened today wasn't criminal, it was human. Flawed, frustrating and hurtful, but human. The appropriate response isn't litigation, but education." Another reporter raised a hand. "Do you think you received this treatment because of ageism or sexism?" Meryl considered the question carefully. "I think both played a role. We live in a society that often renders older women invisible. But this goes beyond any single factor. It's about the assumptions we make when we look at someone and decide in an instant whether they belong." She made eye contact with Patricia. "Earlier today, one of the TSA agents unwrapped a gift I was bringing to my daughter, a vintage director's viewfinder that once belonged to Mike Nichols. When I explained what it was, she didn't believe me. Not because there was anything suspicious about the object, but because she didn't believe I could be who I said I was." Patricia nodded slightly, acknowledging the truth of this account. "That moment crystallizes the issue," Meryl continued. "It wasn't about security protocols. It was about who gets the benefit of the doubt and who doesn't." Sophie stepped forward to stand beside her mother. The family resemblance between them was striking. The same cheekbones, the same quiet intensity. "I'd like to add something," Sophie said. The reporters shifted their attention. "When I arrived at the airport today, I was immediately recognized and treated with respect, partly because of who my mother is, but also because I conformed to expectations. I was dressed in business attire. I spoke with authority. I was visibly angry." She glanced at Meryl. "My mother chose a different approach. She remained calm and dignified throughout a deeply humiliating experience. She didn't demand special treatment or name drop to gain advantage, and for that she was penalized." Meryl smiled at her daughter, then returned her attention to the press. "Airport Director Reynolds and the airline have proposed working together to improve training and protocols. I've agreed to consult on that effort, not because I'm an expert on airport security, but because I believe in the power of recognition, of truly seeing people as they are, not as we assume them to be." A voice from the back called out, "Ms. Streep, what message do you have for the staff who mistreated you today?" The room fell silent as Meryl turned to face Kevin, Patricia, Richard, Thomas and Diane directly. "I would say this. Today was difficult for all of us. You made serious errors in judgment, and those errors had consequences. But what matters now says what you learn from this experience and how you carry that learning forward." She addressed the entire room once more. "In the films I make, characters face moments of truth that reveal who they truly are. Today was such a moment for everyone involved. The story isn't over yet. What happens next, how we all choose to grow from this, that's the final act we haven't written yet." As Meryl concluded her remarks, the room erupted in questions, but the most powerful response came from Diane, who stepped forward with visible emotion. "Ms. Streep," she said, her voice carrying across the room, "thank you for your grace today. I failed to see you for who you are. I promise that won't happen again. Not to you, not to anyone who comes through my gate." Meryl nodded, accepting. The promise for what it was, not just an apology, but a commitment to change. The press conference concluded, but the day's drama was far from over. As reporters dispersed to file their stories, Meryl, Sophie and the airport officials returned to the executive lounge to discuss next steps. "That was masterful," Reynolds said, genuine admiration in his voice. "You transformed what could have been a public relations nightmare into something constructive." Meryl smiled slightly. "Years of script analysis teaches you to look for the story beneath the story." Harrington's phone buzzed continuously with notifications. "Your press conference is already trending. The narrative is shifting from actress mistreated to Streep advocates for change. It's quite remarkable." "The question remains," Sophie interjected, bringing them back to practicalities. "How do we get to Vancouver?" "Our original plan is thoroughly derailed." Reynolds stepped forward. "I've taken the liberty of arranging several options. Our partner airline has a direct flight departing at 6 p.m. Alternatively, we can provide a private charter if you prefer." Meryl and Sophie exchanged glances. "The commercial flight will be fine," Meryl decided. though I suspect I won't be traveling anonymously anymore. A knock at the door announced the arrival of a courier, bearing a carefully wrapped package. Harrington signed for it and presented it to Meryl. "We had this expedited from the finest gift shop in Boston," he explained, as Meryl unwrapped it to reveal an elegant box. Inside was a new leather case containing a pristine vintage director's viewfinder, not unlike the one that had been unwrapped during her security screening. "It's not Mike Nichols' original, of course," Harrington acknowledged, "but we thought perhaps this could replace it until your luggage is retrieved." Meryl examined the viewfinder, touched by the gesture despite its obvious attempt to smooth over the day's transgressions. "Thank you, it's lovely." Sophie inspected it with a director's keen eye. "Actually, this is a Tenenholtz model, even rarer than the one Mom was bringing me. Where did you find it?" Harrington looked pleased. "Our staff made some calls to local film schools and collectors. Apparently, the film department at Boston University was willing to part with it when they heard the circumstances." Meryl raised an eyebrow. "That was resourceful." "We're trying," Reynolds said simply. As arrangements for their evening flight were finalized, Patricia appeared at the door, hesitant but determined. "Ms. Streep, I have something for you." She held out a slightly crumpled envelope, the letter from Spielberg that had been opened during security screening. "I managed to recover this. The seal was broken during inspection, but the contents are intact." Meryl accepted it with grace. "Thank you, Patricia. I also—" Patricia faltered, then continued, "I spoke with my supervisor. Starting tomorrow, I'm being transferred to passenger assistance services while I complete additional training on bias recognition." "That sounds appropriate," Meryl observed. "It is," Patricia agreed, "but I wanted you to know that I requested the transfer before any disciplinary action was recommended." This gave Meryl pause. "Why?" "Because you were right about everything, how we see people, how we make assumptions. I don't want to be that person anymore." Patricia's honesty was raw and unpolished. "My mother raised me better than that." Meryl studied her thoughtfully. "The hardest roles I've ever played were the ones that required me to confront uncomfortable truths about myself. It takes courage to do that off-screen." Patricia nodded, accepting both the compliment and its implied challenge, then quietly withdrew. As the afternoon progressed, each of the staff members who had participated in Meryl's ordeal made similar pilgrimages to the lounge, not just to apologize again, but to share specific actions they were taking. Kevin had requested diversity training. Thomas was reviewing boarding procedures to eliminate subjective assessments. Diane had already drafted new guidelines for passenger verification that relied on documentation rather than appearance. "For they're actually taking this seriously," Sophie observed with surprise after Diane departed. "Public humiliation is a powerful motivator," Meryl noted dryly. "But I think it's more than that. Sometimes people just need to see their blind spots illuminated." Reynolds, who had been coordinating their departure arrangements, approached with an update. "We've reserved a private security lane for your screening before the Vancouver flight. Your luggage has been located and will be transferred directly." "That won't be necessary," Meryl countered. "We'll use the regular security lane like everyone else." Reynolds looked concerned. "Ms. Streep, after today's events—" "After today's events," Meryl interrupted gently. "The last thing I want is special treatment. The point isn't that I should be treated better. It's that everyone should be treated with the same respect and dignity." Sophie grinned. "Mom's always been stubborn about these things," Reynolds conceded with a respectful nod. "As you wish. However, I will be personally overseeing your departure to ensure there are no further incidents." As evening approached, Meryl and Sophie prepared to leave for their rescheduled flight. The airport had arranged a discreet exit from the lounge to the main terminal, but news of Meryl's presence had spread throughout Logan. Travelers watched curiously as they passed, some offering supportive smiles or thumbs-up gestures. A few approached cautiously for autographs, which Meryl graciously provided. At the security checkpoint, a new team of TSA agents welcomed them with professional courtesy. The screening process was thorough but respectful, conducted with none of the earlier suspicion or disdain. When Meryl placed her carry-on items in the bins, including the newly acquired viewfinder. The agent handling them wore gloves and asked permission before inspecting anything. Standard procedure, the agent explained. But I wanted to acknowledge your privacy. Meryl nodded appreciatively. Thank you. As they collected their belongings on the other side, Reynolds appeared. Everything satisfactory? Much improved, Meryl confirmed. They walked together toward the gate, Reynolds providing a running commentary on the changes already being implemented throughout the airport. By tomorrow, all staff will have received preliminary guidance on the new verification protocols. Within the week, we'll begin comprehensive training sessions on unconscious bias recognition. That's remarkably fast, Sophie commented. Reynolds smiled grimly. When Meryl Streep is mistreated at your airport, bureaucratic delays suddenly disappear. At gate C-22, not far from where Meryl had earlier been denied boarding, their new flight was preparing for departure. The gate agents, clearly briefed on the situation, greeted them with warm professionalism. No special announcements were made, no preferential boarding offered, just the standard courtesy extended to all first-class passengers. As they prepared to board, Harrington appeared with a final update. Ms. Streep, the statement we drafted together has been released to the press. Early response has been overwhelmingly positive. I'm glad to hear it, Meryl replied. There's one other thing, Harrington added. The airline's board has approved the creation of a new training initiative on inclusive customer service. If you're still willing, we'd like to name it after you. Meryl considered this. I appreciate the gesture, but I think that would send the wrong message. This isn't about celebrity treatment. It's about equal treatment for everyone. Understood, Harrington. Agreed. We'll develop the program with your input, but keep your name out of the branding. As they said their goodbyes, Reynolds offered a final thought. Ms. Streep, few people would have responded to today's events with such grace and perspective. You've turned a regrettable incident into an opportunity for genuine improvement, Meryl smiled. Well, I've always believed the most compelling stories are the ones where everyone changes by the final scene. With that, she and Sophie boarded their flight, finally continuing the journey that had begun so inauspiciously that morning. As the plane prepared for takeoff, Meryl gazed out the window at Boston Logan Airport, the unexpected setting for a day of confrontation, recognition, and ultimately, resolution. 3 months later, Meryl Streep stepped through the automatic doors of Boston Logan International Airport. Unlike her previous visit, she made no attempt to travel incognito. Her silver hair was styled elegantly, and she wore a simple but beautifully tailored pantsuit. A car service had delivered her directly to the terminal, where Marcus Reynolds waited to greet her. Mrs. Streep, welcome back, he said, extending his hand. I appreciate your willingness to return under the circumstances. I'm pleased to be here, Meryl replied sincerely. I've been following the changes from afar. Reynolds gestured toward the terminal. Would you like to see them firsthand? Meryl nodded, and they began walking through the airport. The differences were subtle but significant. New signage explained security procedures clearly in multiple languages. Staff wore pins saying, "Ask me for assistance," in addition to their name badges. At the check-in counters, signs indicated that verification procedures were standardized for all passengers, regardless of appearance, age, or travel class. The physical changes are just the visible part, Reynolds explained as they walked. The more substantial work has been in staff training and policy overhauls. They paused at a security checkpoint where Reynolds pointed out the new approach in action. Agents provided clear instructions to all travelers, maintained consistent eye contact, and handled personal items with the same care regardless of who they belonged to. Our complaint rates have dropped 30%, Reynolds noted. But, more importantly, our passenger satisfaction metrics have improved across all demographics. As they observed the screening process, a familiar face appeared, Patricia now wearing a different uniform. Miss Streep, she said, clearly surprised. I didn't know you were visiting today. A somewhat impromptu trip, Meryl explained. I'm on my way to New York, but arranged a layover here to see how things have progressed. Patricia straightened her shoulders. I've been working in passenger assistance for 3 months now. It's opened my eyes to a lot. How so? Meryl asked. I work with elderly travelers, passengers with disabilities, families with young children, people who often struggle to navigate the system. Before I saw them as potential delays or complications in the security process. Now I see them as individuals, each with their own story. Meryl smiled. That's quite a perspective shift. It is, Patricia agreed. And it started with you. She hesitated, then added, My mother still doesn't know I was the one who detained Meryl Streep. I haven't had the courage to tell her yet. Perhaps someday, Meryl suggested kindly. They continued their tour, encountering several other staff members who had been involved in Meryl's ordeal. Kevin had been promoted to training new check-in agents, with a focus on equitable customer service. Thomas had helped revise the gate procedures to prevent arbitrary denial of boarding. Diane now served on the airport's newly formed Passenger Experience Committee. The incident with you catalyzed changes we should have made years ago, Reynolds admitted as they reached the food court. Sometimes it takes a high-profile failure to drive meaningful reform. At a nearby table, a woman in her 70s sat alone, looking confused as she tried to read her boarding pass. A staff member approached her, offering assistance with genuine warmth rather than condescension. Meryl watched the interaction with approval. That's the real test, she observed, how you treat the passengers when you think no one important is watching. Reynolds nodded thoughtfully. We've tried to make that the cornerstone of our new approach. They made their way to Gate C18, the same gate where Meryl had been denied boarding 3 months earlier. A plaque had been installed nearby, though it bore no names or specific references to the incident. Instead, it read simply, Dignity is a universal right, not a privilege. We are committed to honoring it for every traveler. Subtle but meaningful, Meryl commented. We wanted something that would remind staff of the principles without turning the incident into a spectacle, Reynolds explained. As they stood discussing the changes, a family approached, parents with 3 young children clearly tired from travel. The gate agent welcomed them warmly, got down to eye level with the youngest child, and offered coloring books to keep them occupied during the wait. 3 months ago, that same agent might have seen them as a potential disruption, Reynolds noted. Meryl checked her watch. I should be heading to my gate. My flight to New York leaves in an hour. Of course. Can I escort you there? No need, Meryl replied. I'd like to experience the airport as a regular passenger. Reynolds understood. I appreciate your coming back, Mrs. Streep. Your willingness to engage constructively after how you were treated has made all the difference. The credit belongs to your team for being receptive to change, Meryl countered. Not everyone would have been. As they parted ways, Meryl navigated toward her gate, intentionally passing through the standard security lane. The process was efficient and respectful. A few travelers recognized her, but the staff remained professionally focused on their duties without special treatment or fanfare. Reaching her gate, Meryl found a quiet corner to call Sophie. How's Boston? Sophie asked when she answered. Transformed, Meryl replied, or at least evolving in the right direction. The power of Meryl Streep, Sophie teased, changing airport culture one security checkpoint at a time. Meryl laughed softly. Hardly, but it is gratifying to see concrete changes. Your interview about it airs tonight, Sophie reminded her. Are you nervous? 3 weeks earlier, Meryl had given a single, in-depth interview about the incident to a respected journalist. She had insisted that the focus remain on the broader issues of unconscious bias and institutional change rather than personal grievance. Not nervous, Meryl considered, hopeful that it contributes something constructive to the conversation. The early clips look good, Sophie assured her. You managed to be both diplomatic and direct. After finishing her call, Meryl observed the bustling gate area. A distinguished older gentleman in casual clothes was being assisted by a gate agent. With the same courtesy, she extended to a business traveler in an expensive suit. A young woman wearing a hijab received a warm smile as her boarding pass was scanned. A mother traveling alone with twin toddlers was offered pre-boarding without having to request it. Small moments, subtle shifts, but meaningful ones. Boarding began for Meryl's flight. When her group was called, she joined the line like any other. Passenger. The gate agent scanning passes recognized her immediately. Miss Streep, she said, her professional demeanor momentarily giving way to a flash of admiration. "Welcome aboard. Thank you for choosing to fly with us again," Meryl smiled. "Thank you for making it a pleasant experience this time." As she walked down the jetway, Meryl reflected on how a single difficult day had sparked meaningful change, not just for her, but potentially for thousands of travelers who would never know the story behind the improvements they experienced. The flight attendant greeted her warmly at the aircraft door. "Welcome aboard, Mrs. Streep. May I show you to your seat?" "Thank you," Meryl replied him, "but I know where I'm going." And she did, not just to seat 2A, but forward into a world where a moment of recognition could transform how we see and treat one another, where dignity was not a privilege of fame or status, but a right belonging to everyone, where an unpleasant encounter could become a catalyst for growth. As the plane prepared for takeoff, Meryl gazed out the window at Boston Logan Airport, no longer the site of humiliation but of redemption, of progress, of possibility.